Hi everyone, this is Sohi Lisi from Checker. Welcome to the webinar, Demystifying Employment Background Checks. We're thrilled to be here today to have a 60-minute webinar on this topic. And to the extent that you have any questions during the presentation, please use the right-hand box to send them to us and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. And to give you some background on Checker before we dive in, we are a software-driven background check company based in sometimes sunny San Francisco, California. We focus on making it really easy for you to run background checks so you can focus on driving your business forward. We are currently the 4th largest consumer reporting agency in the US and have customers such as Allstate, Uber, Home Depot, just to name a few. I also want to mention that we have a great partnership with Workable so that you can order background checks directly on their platform, and they are also on the call today to answer any Workable specific questions at the end. I'm really excited to introduce today's panelist, Jared Callahan. He's a licensed private investigator with 20 years of experience in the employment screening industry, and currently he's an enterprise customer success manager for Checker. And with that, I will turn it over to Jared.
Thanks, Sohi. So background check 101, how does it work? So let's dive right in. In background screening, the process, it has to be compliant to begin with. So as Sohi mentioned, we're Checker, and we're accredited by the National Association of Professional Background Screeners. To do a background check, to conduct one that is, we have to follow various state and federal laws and guidelines. The first one to mention is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, or FCRA. Some people call it FCRA. Don't let the word credit fool you. It has to do with anything regarding a background check. The Fair Credit Reporting Act is under the Federal Trade Commission, and again, it oversees how we as a background firm and you as a would-be employer conduct a background check on an individual. In addition to the FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act, there's also the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, specifically under Title VII. That talks a little bit about not being able to discriminate against somebody just because they have something that's potentially adverse on their background. In addition to the federal laws that govern background checks, there's also state-level regulations that we have to be concerned about. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we proceed throughout the presentation. So why perform background checks at all? And there's a few reasons why. First and foremost, background checks promote a safe and profitable workplace. So workers today in 2017 expect that a background check is going to be conducted on them, but also it makes them feel comfortable knowing their colleagues have been screened as well. So again, in 2017, it's pretty much a given that a background check is going to be required of an individual before he or she begins work. Second, a background check shows that you have exercised due diligence as an organization. Due diligence is a legal term essentially for the act of performing a background check in the first place. And then there's a couple of pitfalls if we don't do background checks, and that is negligent hiring and negligent retention. So conducting background checks as a policy for your organization shows that you exercise due diligence. Negligent hiring would be if you hired somebody, but you didn't check out their background, and sure enough, they go on to harm or hurt a customer or coworker. That's negligent hiring. And negligent hiring lawsuits are on the rise across the U.S. Negligent retention is arguably worse than negligent hiring in that negligent retention occurs when you knew or should have known that somebody had an untoward or unfit background, but you hired them anyway. Maybe they were a rock star and you wanted to hire that individual. That's negligent retention. The bottom line with respect to background checks is it's a low-cost risk management tool that most organizations are in fact applying today, and it should really be a consideration. So what is a background check? And it comes down to two different ideas here. One is public records and two is private records. What a background check is not, it's not an invasion of privacy, it's not an FBI type of profile. Rather, it's a check of public and private data sources, and all the while, the consumer's rights are protected throughout the process. And when I say consumer, I'm talking about the individual we're doing the background check on. So let's dive a little bit deeper into both public and private records. Public records consist of these 4 bullet points here. There's criminal records, civil records, sex offender registries, and sort of a combined national and global watch list. So let's take a deep dive into each. First and foremost, let's talk about criminal records. And as you see here, we can break down criminal records at both the county, state, and federal level. Here in the U.S., there's 3,200 counties. In California, where Sohi and I sit, there's 58 counties. Every single county within the United States is autonomous as to how they make records public. So I'll talk about that for a moment. We've all heard the term public record, so each one of us can walk into any courthouse in America and check each other out to see if we have records on each other. And each county makes their information public in different ways. The most common way is what's called a public access terminal, or PAT. Essentially, the way it works is you'd walk into a court, sit down in front of a laptop-looking computer, and conduct your search. What's key here is that to conduct your search, just don't go in with name only. You have to have some identifying information. So typically that includes a date of birth, maybe a social security number, but not usually. That's kind of a misnomer that's out there. Perhaps a driver's license number, etc. But we need some kind of identifying information in addition to the individual's name. And again, most courts make that information, that searchability, available via this public access terminal. Those courts that don't make that information available via the PAT or public access terminal typically have a court clerk who assists in the court search. Essentially what happens is you walk up with a pen and a pad and say, I'd like to do searches on these folks. Here's our identifying information, such as the date of birth, etc. And depending on how that particular court works, the court clerk can either go back and search the records for you real time and be right back, or quite often what will happen is they'll say, great, come back next Tuesday, that sort of thing. Some counties, thankfully, make the records available online, but that number is actually very low. So I would say roughly less than 10% of all counties in these United States make their information available online. At the county level, what we're checking for are both felonies and misdemeanors. So depending on the particular state's reporting guidelines, and we'll talk about that later, what you can and can't receive. So depending on the county's court guidelines, we'll be able to show you felonies and misdemeanor information, either from convictions or pending cases, and sometimes dismissed cases. And again, we'll talk about that in a moment. So that's at the county level. Then we move to the state level with respect to criminal records. And contrary to popular belief, there's actually only a few states that make their entire state available online or searchable through one database. A good example of that would be the state of New York. New York has 62 counties, and all 62 counties in the state of New York are available through a statewide search, which is called the Office of Court Administration, or OCA. But most states do not aggregate all their counties' criminal records into one searchable database. So it's got to be county by county when we're checking for records. So next, let's move on to federal records. We've talked about county, we've talked about state. The federal criminal record search process is through a system called PACER. And PACER is an acronym for public access to the federal government's criminal records. Now, the good thing about PACER is you are, in fact, able to check the entire United States federal court criminal system, but it does have its downside, that being the inherent lack of identifiers. So what's nice about a county level search is, as a researcher, I can walk into any court and let's poke fun of my name here, Jared Callahan, and I give my date of birth, and the court can show whether or not there's records on me. The problem with federal court records is there's this inherent lack of identifiers, so rarely do we find full dates of birth, full 9-digit social security numbers, addresses, or driver's license numbers associated with a federal record. So searching them can be a very arduous process. Having done background checks for a long time, I can tell you that federal records, the cases are several hundred pages long. And it's quite literally, it reads like a Tom Clancy novel. You've got to go soup to nuts and figure out, is this my person or not, number one? And then ultimately, number two, if it is in fact our person, is this something that's what we call reportable, meaning did it fall within a certain amount of time? And we'll chat about that in a moment. For a case to be a federal record, what defines that? So at the risk of sounding callous, if I hear in San Francisco, Sohi commits assault and battery on me and beats me up, most likely she's going to be arrested and hopefully convicted, right, of assault and battery in San Francisco County. However, if I was a mail carrier, so now I'm a federal employee, and so he assaults me then, it's now a federal crime because I'm a federal employee. So it has to meet the mark of certain requirements to be a federal case. As an example, all bank robberies are federal crimes because banks are protected by the Federal Department of Insurance Corporation, FDIC. It makes it a federal crime. Cases that move across state lines. So if someone's kidnapped in California but brought to Nevada, now there's competing jurisdictions, it becomes a federal case. Another example to look at would be a drug case. If an individual has a small amount of, say, marijuana in their person, it might be a misdemeanor at the county level, whereas if they had 10,000 pounds of marijuana in the back of a van, it's more often the case not casual use, but it's a distribution network. So larger distribution networks get treated as a federal crime. Same thing can be said for child pornography distribution and things of that nature because it goes across the internet, again, across state lines. So that's the difference between the three levels of criminal: county level, state, and federal. The devil's in the details, and we can get pretty deep in the weeds there. Now let's move on to, within public records, civil records. So with respect to civil records, there's both county and federal, much like the criminal side. The difference, however, is at the county level with respect to civil records, it's broken out into upper and lower court. So upper is where you'd find things like lawsuits. Has this person sued, or have they sued others? And it could be argued to be job relevant if they, for example, sue their past employers. At the lower level, that's where you find family law. So divorce, child custody, arguably not relevant to the job. So most employers don't check at the lower level. If they're doing civil records checks at all, it's typically going to be at the upper level. That's on the county side. At the federal level, all bankruptcies in these United States are conducted at the federal level with respect to civil records. You'll never find bankruptcy information at a county civil record. It's always at the federal level. And that can be Chapter 7, 11, or 13, whether it's personal or company bankruptcy. There's also lawsuits involving federal government that can be found at the federal level. So if I sue the federal government or the federal government sues me, again, you'd find it at the federal civil level. A good example of this would be the Martha Stewart case that happened several years back. So Martha Stewart was tried and convicted in federal criminal court for insider trading with the Securities and Exchange Commission. On the criminal side, she was sent off to the dormitory prison, as it were, and then the federal government sued her in civil court to recoup the losses of the American people. So that's a good example of a federal versus county situation. So stepping aside from criminal and civil records, now let's talk a little bit about sex offender registry. So the sex offender registry search is a search of all states as well as other government databases, and it'll give you varying degrees of levels of sex offender registry information. It's a little bit different than somebody logging into like a Megan's Law type database. So I, as a citizen, can check a state's database to find out if there's any sex offenders living near me, and typically it'll break down the level of sex offense. Most states have a 3-level system, number 1 being least egregious, and number 3 being the worst. In California, to give an example, from an employment screening perspective, all we as a background firm can report to you would be records of a 2nd or 3rd degree, not level 1. At level 1 in California is along the lines of he was 19, she was 17, but it was consensual type of thing. Massachusetts has its own version of levels 1, 2, and 3. It also does not allow level 1 offenses. And what's interesting is it doesn't allow certain level 2 offenses. So every state has a little bit of a different nuance as to how they allow background firms and would-be employers to consider sex offenders in their state. Finally, in the public records list here, we're going to talk a little bit about national and global watch lists. There's a term called the National Criminal Search, and the word national is a bit misleading in that it's not a true countrywide FBI type of search. What it does, however, is it collects about 36 million different records, various state, county, and other agencies' databases. It, however, should not be used as a primary means of checking one's criminal information. What it's good at is what we call kind of a pointer database or a tips and leads database. So you may have somebody who shows up as having some type of record, say randomly in Scottsdale, Arizona. It will tell you that there's a record there, but it won't tell you what happened. It also won't tell you if it's your person. So let's use a very common name like John Smith. John Smith shows to have a criminal record in Scottsdale, Arizona. It may have a case number, but that's really all we have. The next step required is for us us being checker that is, to go to Scottsdale, Arizona and find out, number one, is it your John Smith or not? And number two, if it is the information that we found what we call reportable, meaning is it something that happened within the parameters from that state where we can legally report that information to you. There's also this idea of the Fair Credit Reporting Act and database criminal records checks. So we talked about the FCRA, or Fair Credit Reporting Act, at the beginning of our presentation. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, to throw my legalese hat on here a little bit, Section 613 is what's called a contemporaneous notice. And essentially all it says is, if you find a hit in the National Criminal Database, you, the CRA, Consumer Reporting Agency, which is what we at Checker are, have to go find out what the end result was. And we, in fact, do that for you. So that's the national database. The global watch list is really kind of this collection of 200 plus databases. It includes terrorist lists, Interpol, OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, established post 9/11, looking for monetary kind of insights into any potential terrorist activity. So it's a good place to kind of start, so to speak, with respect to your background check. So that's public records in a very large nutshell. Now we're going to transition into private records. Private records can include motor vehicle reports, verifications, and credit reports. So let's take a deep dive there. First off, we have a motor vehicle report. Same thing as a DMV printout, but provided in a much more easy-to-use format. So a motor vehicle report will show any and all violations and accidents. It'll show the status of a driver's license. The status can be that of valid or revoked, suspended, etc. From an accident perspective, most states don't report who's at fault in an accident. I just want to point that out. But you will get violations and accidents over at least the last 3 years. Most states report the last 5 to 7. And there may in fact be some overlap between what's found in a motor vehicle report and what's found in a county criminal search. An example of that would be a DUI or DWI, depending on what state you sit in. So if someone's been convicted of a DUI charge in a county and it's also found on the motor vehicle report, you'll see some overlap. It doesn't always happen. So for example, if I've been convicted of a DUI in Los Angeles County, but I've never lived there, the chances are you probably haven't checked that county for any criminal record, but you would in fact find it if you ran a motor vehicle report on me. From a reciprocal perspective, some but not all states reciprocate their data. So if someone moves from one state to another, before they can get a driver's license in the new state, they have to surrender their old license. And again, what some states will do is essentially take the data from the old state and make that available on the new motor vehicle report, but not all states do that. I wanted to point that out. The nice thing about a motor vehicle report is it is in fact a true statewide search. So sometimes what will happen is you'll catch things in a motor vehicle report that you might not if you just check county by county. A DUI is an example of that. And most drug charges, in fact, show up via the motor vehicle report. It's rare that somebody walking on the street gets charged and perhaps convicted having drugs in their person, whereas a lot of times it starts out in a vehicle. So somebody doesn't make a signal for a left turn, is pulled over, and maybe the officer smells drugs or sees drug paraphernalia in the car. That's typically how it happens with respect to a motor vehicle report. And it is a true statewide search. So that's motor vehicle reports. Next, we're going to talk about verifications. And verifications include employment verification, education verification, and reference checking. I want to point out that reference checking is different than employment verifications. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges of verifications. Quite frankly, the verification process is really the Achilles heel of the background checking industry. It's very challenging due to the manual requirements of having to essentially manage documents and phone calls back and forth. There are some databases out there that are available to verify past employment and to verify education credentials, but for the most part, you still have to pick up the phone and call. So approximately 30% of all employment verifications can be conducted through a database. For example, there's a work number for everyone. And there's also the idea of doing database checks for education. Roughly 40% of education verification can be done through a database called the National Student Clearinghouse. So what happens at Checker is we first hit those databases to see if in fact that past employer or that educational institution can be found within that database. And then if not, we begin the process of picking up the telephone and calling past employers and educational institutions. Again, it's very challenging. There's a lot of back and forth. In this day and age, if someone doesn't recognize a phone number, they're apt not to answer, but let it go to voicemail. So that process can be challenging. On the education side, if we can't verify the verification through a database, we have to contact the registrar's office at that particular school. So if the school happens to be out on summer break or winter break, we simply leave a message and we have to literally wait until the registrar's office gets back into session. And of course, we can't make phone calls on the weekend because the schools are closed, so it can be quite challenging. Then, from an education perspective, what if the highest degree awarded was not at the collegiate level, but instead was a high school or a GED or some kind of exam administered by the state? CRAs, Checker included, can in fact verify that information, but that gets even more challenging. So things to consider. If the verification cannot be made successfully by Checker, you're not out of the woods just yet. What you can do, and what most employers do, is ask for and require some sort of documentation from the candidate. So on the employment side, that equals asking for a W-2, 1099, a pay stub, etc. Some sort of agreed upon documentation that verifies they did in fact work at where they said they worked. And when we do in fact make a successful verification of employment, we're simply asking for dates worked, titles held, and sometimes we're able to verify salary. We're not doing a true reference check per se of how good or bad somebody worked. Again, that's a reference check which is separate, and I'll talk about that in a moment. On the education side, if we're not able to successfully verify education, you as the would-be employer can ask for the degree, a copy of the degree, a diploma, transcripts, etc. From a references perspective, this is personal and professional references, sort of the cheerleading section of the application, if you will. Background companies, including Checker, can in fact verify, or I should say perform employment references, but keep in mind it's different than verifying somebody actually worked where they said they worked. References are, we're talking to past supervisors or managers, whereas a verification of employment, we're going to the source of the verification, so either a database, or if at the actual past company, we're talking to the HR department or personnel department. So that's verifications. The next private record we'll talk about for a moment is credit reports. Credit reports are a bit controversial with respect to it from a privacy perspective, but you can in fact run them. But what's really key here is that you must have a permissible purpose to run the credit report. It's got to be job relevant. So the example of that would be a CFO, you might run it on that individual, a bookkeeper, a cashier, etc. You probably wouldn't want to run a credit report on an auto mechanic, for example. That's not relevant. So again, you must have a permissible purpose, and it's got to be job relevant. So let's talk about producing the actual background check itself. So what we have here is kind of a step-by-step procedure as far as producing the background check here. So when an individual comes onto the platform, he or she will provide their personal information and sign an authorization. The personal information includes their first name, last name, their middle name, or they'll declare that they don't have a middle name. That, by the way, helps us determine if it's our person. So if a person has a common name such as Mary Jones, and we don't have a middle name, it's going to be harder to determine whether or not it's our Mary Jones. So first step is the individual gives us their information and signs off on the authorization form. We'll talk about that authorization form in a minute. Once that information has been entered, our system then uses the applicant's name, date of birth, and social security information to verify address history. That's key because that's telling us, as your background firm, where to check for information, that is what counties. We talked about there's 3,200 counties that are out there. So what names to check under and where to check under. Number 3, the system then performs its check, a combination of database and manual searches. So we're checking for criminal records, we're checking motor vehicle reports, perhaps we're calling past employers, educational institutions, etc. Number 4, once all the information is conducted, performed, and returned back to checker, our quality assurance team takes a look at it and performs QA as needed, and then finalizes the report. Finally, the report itself is made available for both you, the end user. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act defines employers as end users. It's made available to you and the applicant, or as the Fair Credit Reporting Act calls the applicant, the consumer. So the nice thing here is that when I say our, checkers compliance filters make sure that you're only viewing criminal records that you're allowed to consider. And I'll talk about that for just a moment. So there's federal laws and there's state laws like we talked about. But in California, where Sohi and I sit, for example, California is what we call a no-arrest state. So you as a would-be employer cannot consider records that did not result in a conviction. In California, you can only consider records that are convicted or pending cases. But if it resulted in a dismissal, we can't consider that in this state here in California. So every state has a little version or miniature version, if you will, of the FCRA. So our compliance filters are pre-built to make sure you're only getting in the report what you may consider. We also go through a yearly audit, compliance audit by outside counsel who specializes in background check law and procedure. Before the background check even starts, however, we have to get the candidate or applicant's consent to do so. There's actually a consent, disclosure, and authorization. So the documents include separate and distinct documents that don't have extraneous information or waivers of liability. The waivers of liability term, I want to point that out for just a moment. Last month, the federal government, actually specifically the Federal Trade Commission, handed down a pretty large fine against a large Fortune 500 company for having a waiver of liability within its consent forms. So we have to be careful about it, is that we don't kind of hide language that talks about waiving liability. They need to be clear and conspicuous and make sure the applicant understands what he or she is signing off on. The information has to be presented to the individual prior to running the background check. The forms have to be signed by the applicant. They don't have to be in ink form. So way back in 1998, then President Bill Clinton signed in the e-sign Act. So the forms can be signed electronically. And finally, they have to be saved by the employer for 5 years, the forms that is. We save them electronically for you, so you don't have to worry about that. But we just wanted to point that out. And there's also a plus 1 year, because once the 5 years goes by, the individual has a year from a statute of limitations perspective. Should also point out here that different states have different disclosures and authorizations as far as their wording requirements are concerned. We talked a little bit about California. New York has some special language. Pennsylvania does, as does Massachusetts. The nice thing about our system is we'll make sure that by determining where the applicant resides, we're only going to properly display each state's notices to your applicant. So that's the authorization, consent, and disclosure form. So now the report is complete. Now what? And there's really 3 options here. So once a background check is complete in Checker's system, it's going to be one of 2 statuses. The report is either going to be clear, and we have this green clear here, which means just as it says there, the report is complete without any potential adverse information. That's what we all want. And 9 out of 10 reports come back just that way. Or that 10th one, that exception, is that the report is complete and consider. So when a report is marked as consider at Checker, we're saying it's complete and it has potentially adverse information, which requires an individualized assessment to make a decision as to hiring the individual. So what is an individualized assessment? At the beginning of our presentation, We talked about the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act, but we also talked a little bit about the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC for short. Under Title VII of the EEOC, what it says is that we as employers cannot automatically disqualify somebody because of their background check. And specifically, it's talking about criminal records and credit reports. So to be in compliance with the EEOC under Title VII, if there's a record that comes back and you're considering not hiring the individual because of it, you have to go through this individualized assessment process. It's pretty easy, but it's very critical that you do so. And really the criteria for that is looking at the information that came back, determining when the crime happened. Was it 6 months ago or 6 years ago? What was the nature and gravity of the offense? And then after taking into consideration when it happened and what it was, asking yourself the question, is this criminal record relevant to the job? And if you answer the question no, then you probably shouldn't consider that in your hiring decision. If, however, you can answer the question yes, it's relevant, then maybe, in fact, you do, in fact, deny the individual because of the report itself. The key here is to be consistent in your decision making. So if and when you start receiving reports back that are considered and you're making what we call adverse decisions based on them, you want to kind of use that as your benchmark so that future decisions are decided similarly. So that's clear and consider. A report can also be put into suspended mode. What that simply means is that we checker, we need information from the candidate and we can't complete the report without it. That happens when we're having a date of birth or identity mismatch challenge on our side. We just want to make sure we have the right person that we're doing the background check on before we proceed. What happens there is when the system isn't sure about the identity of the individual or we need a driver's license, our system will ping the individual via email to say, hey, we need a copy of your identification card, your driver's license, etc. Whatever it is we might need, our system will email the individual. We'll do that over a 7-day period repeatedly, and at the end of 7 days, if we don't have what we need from the individual, meaning they haven't uploaded it to what we call our applicant portal, the report will go into suspended mode. What that essentially does is it pauses the report. It kind of does it forever or indefinitely, and we've literally had candidates who days, weeks, and sometimes even months down the road have finally gotten around to uploading to the applicant portal their required driver's license or ID, and the background check picks up right where it left off. So that's when the report is complete. Now let's talk about the adverse action process. So again, this is when the report comes back considered, and you've done the individualized assessment and have decided, I don't want to move forward with this individual. This is a very key compliant component to your background check process. You'll want to make sure you get this right every single time. So the adverse action process is really a two-step process. There's a pre-adverse action and a post-adverse action. So I'll walk you through each. So again, you've made the decision not to hire the individual based in whole or in part because of the background check. So pre-adverse action, what happens there is you, the end user or the employer, send out a notice to the applicant which says essentially due to the information in the report, you're not going to be moving forward with that individual. And our system makes it nice in that we're able to present what the adverse information might be. So it specifically calls out that potentially adverse information. It's a form letter. It goes along with a copy of the individual's rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, as well as various state rights if in fact the individual is in those particular states that have those requirements. So it's a pre-adverse action because you haven't made final decision yet. You're giving them a chance to review it and contest it should they wish to do so. So once the individual has been sent off the pre-adverse action notice, and again it goes out via email, they have 7 days to respond to it. They can respond to it by contacting either you, the end user or employer, or us here at Checker, your consumer reporting agency. And there's a few ways they can go about contacting you or us. They can do it by phone, email, letter, fax, and literally the extent of the law allows individuals to stop by Checker's headquarters here in San Francisco and talk to somebody about the report, any concerns that they've got. So we say they have 7 days here, and that 7 days is actually an interpretation by most labor lawyers. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act is kind of an interesting document in that it says employers must give applicants a reasonable amount of time. So it actually doesn't give an exact number of days. And we realize that the term reasonable is not only in the eye of the beholder, but really it's in the eye and the ears of a would-be jury. So 7 days is the agreed upon time, again, amongst most labor law firms. After that 7th day, however, if the applicant has not contacted either you, the would-be employer, or us here at Checker, we then send off on your behalf the post-adverse action. The post-adverse action makes your decision final, that you're not moving forward with the individual. So again, it's a two-step process: a pre-adverse action, giving the individual a chance to dispute it or talk about it, and then a post-adverse action some 7 days later. Now, the nice thing from a legal perspective is you can, in fact, move on to another qualified applicant, and the only consideration you have to consider here is after the 7-day window closes, if, in fact, the individual successfully disputes it, maybe it wasn't them or the details are a little bit different, the only consideration you have to have is to consider that individual for another open position in the future. Going to take a quick water break here for a second. Excuse me, thank you. So what happens then if during that 7-day window the candidate disputes the report with either you or us? What do we do here? So what will happen just from a systems perspective is that the dispute will suspend the report, and it's going to block you, the would-be employer, from a post-adverse action until Checker completes what's called a reinvestigation. So if someone disputes the report, either says, wholesale, that's not me, I don't know what you're talking about, or yes, that's me, but it should have been a misdemeanor, not a felony, or some other reason they have a legitimate dispute, we completely stop the report, we stop the possibility of a post-adverse action from going out, and we conduct what's called a reinvestigation. Legally, Checker and you, the end user or employer, have 30 days to conduct the reinvestigation. It typically never takes that long, but that's what the federal law gives us. And the reinvestigation is specific to the area of the report that the individual is disputing. So we're not running a brand new report all over again. We're simply going to the area of the report or to the court records, et cetera, and we're saying an applicant is disputing the report, what say you? We're doing a really kind of deep dive, whether it be a past employer who says no, they never worked here, or a court record, et cetera. Now, after the reinvestigation, 3 things are going to happen. I should say 3 possibilities. Either we can completely keep the report the same as it was, not changing anything. We modify it. So I give the example of a felony to a misdemeanor. Or we completely get rid of the potentially adverse information that's in the report. 3 possibilities can happen there. Once the reinvestigation is complete, the applicant, him or herself, they'll get an email saying just that, the reinvestigation is complete, and now here is the completed reinvestigation results of the report. And you also get a copy of the reinvestigation. And then from there, depending on the results of that, if the report is now a clear to consider, you go through the process all over again. So again, adverse action, very important. It's often missed, and a lot of times what employers make the mistake of doing is only sending out the pre-adverse action, but not following up with the post-adverse action. You also want to make sure that you're tracking all of your pre- and post-adverse actions so that if and when you're ever audited, you can point to an audit trail. And of course at Checker, we make the system simple to use as far as being able to track your pre- and post-adverse actions. Okay, so now we've kind of walked through your possible outcomes of a report and whether or not there's going to be adverse action. Let's talk about some common questions when it comes to background checks. So we have a few here. Number 1, how long do most reports take? So most background checks are going to take about 2 to 3 business days on average. It's key to point out business days because background checks can't really be conducted over the weekend or on holidays because we're checking at courts, and of course courts close on weekends and holidays. So 2 to 3 business days on the average. Most reports, we should point out here, will be faster, but some will take longer, which kind of is a nice segue into question 2. Why would some reports take longer to complete? And there's really a myriad of reasons, but let's talk first about slow county searches. So we talked at the onset about how there's 3,200 counties in the United States to search. Most come back in a reasonable amount of time, but there are certain counties that are out there that just inherently take longer than others. And I'll kind of point out a few. Most, if not all, counties in the state of Massachusetts just take a long time to check. So you can be looking at a week or more. Here where we are in California, San Luis Obispo County and Santa Barbara County can take a while. And the reasons for that is those counties are what we call court clerk search counties. So you can't check online. You also just can't walk into their courts and plop down in front of a public access terminal. You have to go to the court clerk and say, I want to check these names. Here's the identifiers. And they typically tell the court researcher to come back in a few days or even up to a week or more. So that can be a reason. Or from a records perspective, maybe we found something and we need to have that information verified. So sometimes you'll find a record in a public access terminal. It'll say, yes, this person has a criminal record and here's a case number, but that's all the details we have. The problem is that doesn't give us enough information to report that back to you. So we have to ask for the file. We're going to look in the file soup to nuts to figure out what happened, is this the right person, etc. That can take some time, especially if the record is older or you're in a large county. So Cook County, Illinois, for example, where Chicago sits, can take a while for that reason. Los Angeles County can. So the larger a metropolitan area, typically when there's a quote-unquote hit, meaning a record found, the longer the turnaround time is going to be. The nice thing here is this is less than 10% of all searches we check, so that shouldn't be an issue, but we just wanted to point that out. Another reason reports can take a while is on the verification side of things. So if we're verifying employers, past employers are verifying education, and those individuals just don't get back to us in a reasonable amount of time. We talked about the registrar's office scenario before. So there are legitimate reasons why a report can be slowed down. But again, it's going to be the exception, not the norm. Question 3, what are exceptions? So in checkers terminology, our nomenclature, we talked about this before, where when we need something from the individual, so we need some kind of document, a social security card, driver's license, ID, etc., our system flags an exception which sends an applicant email asking for specifically what we need. There's a link to our secure applicant portal. We tell them exactly what we need. But every now and again, people don't check email, and they just don't upload those documents in a timely manner. That can slow things down. And a common reason why we might need a document is when inputting the information, maybe there's a typo in their name, they fat-fingered their date of birth, etc. Those kinds of things can happen. Next slide here, what background check options are available? So we've really talked through kind of A to Z, the various background checks that are available. So just to kind of reiterate and go back, there's criminal records checks at the county level, at the federal level, at the state level. We can check sex offender registries for you. We run an address and name locator that's based off of the social security number, which tells us where to check and under what names. We can conduct verifications for you on both the employment and education side. We can also do reference checks for that matter. We've talked about motor vehicle reports. One thing we haven't talked about is the ability to run drug screening. So some clients require a drug screening beforehand. We can certainly help facilitate that. We offer, for those interested, both a 5-panel and 10-panel. Everything is done electronically, so no paper is changing hands. So these are various types of background checks that we have available. And then how do you run background checks on Workable? So the nice thing here is that we've got a great integration with Workable, which allows you to order background checks directly on their platform. And specifically, here's how you can do this. So within the Workable recruiting pipeline, there are 6 different stages: sourced, applied, phone screen, interview, offer, and hired. And you can run the background checks at the offer stage. So if you look at the screenshot here, on the candidate's profile, you'll see a magnifying glass icon at the top right-hand menu, highlighted here on the screen. You simply click on that, and you'll be able to start running background checks right away.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Jared, for presenting today, and appreciate you joining the webinar.
All right.
Have a good day.